So we've just admitted everyone in the waiting room, and we'll wait for the numbers to go down, and then we will introduce, here is everyone. We will introduce you in just 1 second, Derek. So, if I could ask a bit of housekeeping to start with, could everyone possibly put, if you're not already, put yourselves on mute, as this webinar is being recorded, so we don't want any feedback while it's happening. And without further ado, I would like to welcome you to the second Mammal Society webinar of our series. We are very lucky to be joined by Derek Crawley today, who is going to talk us about everything harvest mouse related. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Derek.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. And hopefully you can now see that full screen. That's lovely. Good evening, everyone. So tonight's talk is all about harvest mouse. It's National Mammal Week, and this is one of the mammals that we really want to get a lot more records on. And we'll talk about how to go about that as the talk progresses. But needle in the haystack is what I've entitled this, and it really is that case. It's a case of trying to find evidence of the actual mice. Very, very rarely do you actually see one unless you've actually trapped one. I think I've only ever seen one wild, one in the wild, and that was actually running away from me as it goes through the vegetation when I was trying to find a nest. Other than that, all my records have either been from field work or they've been from live trapping. Now, it's our smallest rodent. It's unique in this country because it has what we call a prehensile tail. So it actually uses its tail as an extra limb, if you like. It winds it round vegetation. It acts as a brake as they travel up and down the stems, especially on the downward side. But they also use it as, when they're moving around as a balance, as a counterbalancer as they move. But when they need to reach between stems, then it's basically tail grips one stem, back feet are on it, and then they reach forward out into that void to try and reach the stems on the other side. So it's really quite important adaptation that they have within grassland. When we actually look at the animal itself, it's quite small, smallest, as I said, of the rodents. It works out to be about 6 to 8 grams, as opposed to something like 20 for dormice, not dormice, sorry, wood mice, etc. I've forgotten how big it is. It's about 5 to 6 centimeters long, and then the tail on top. It has this very characteristic golden brown, almost russet color, unlike the other mice. It still has the big eyes because it is mostly active around dawn and dusk, although it will be active during the day, definitely during the summer months. In the winter, it tends to be much more nocturnal. The ears are quite prominent, but the giveaway when you see one of these is its coloration. They are active at the stalk level, and they are extremely good climbers, as you can see here. And you can see how that tail swirls around to try and get the balance. And as they stop, it then actually curls around vegetation. These ones are in captivity, but it does get you that idea of how the animal moves through the vegetation and just how small the stems are that they're actually using and are quite happily balancing on. Now, somebody asked me the other day, how fast are they? Well, I consider that to be quite fast as it moves through the vegetation, but they're not runners. They're just a steady movement as it goes along. If we look at their features, so here you've got it balancing just on its back legs, front legs coming forward to actually hold the food, which in this case are these seed heads from willow, and the tail will actually be wrapped around from that. So one of the questions that always comes up is what do they actually eat? And most of the time it's on seeds. There's a little bit of leaf matter that they take, about 15% on insects, then berries and fruits and other fungi and grains and stuff like that. But it all depends on what time of the year they're actually looking at it. There's obviously not seeds all the way through. They don't hibernate, so they are active all the way through the winter, and they've got to get enough food to actually survive within that. Within that, they eat about 30% of their body weight each day. If you compare that to something like a common shrew, which is basically eating at least its own body weight a day, the difference basically comes down to the fact that seeds have a greater protein level, less water in them than insects do. So therefore, although they still lose an awful lot of body heat being small, they don't need to consume quite that quantity that the shrews do. If we look at their distribution, this is taken from the current atlas, which came out last year. On this one, you can actually see that the 1960 to 1992 records, which is the last published atlas, are in red, and they're sites where we haven't managed to rediscover harvest mice during this recording period. Those that are in dark green are sites where we've only been found them in this recording period, and the lighter green ones are actually turned up in both. So trying to work out whether or not this animal has maintained its distribution or actually reduced, you could basically see we think it's on the decline from these records, but it's this difficulty of trying to record a very difficult animal to see. And that's what we want to look at, is how you actually go about finding these elusive animals with a chance to see them if you're really lucky and when it comes down to traps. You can see that most of our records are for England. There aren't that many within Wales, and there's only a few records in Scotland, and we will talk about that more a little bit later on. So most of our records come from nests. These are breeding nests about the size of a tennis ball and a little bit smaller that you find in long vegetation or tussocks, okay, where they're actually attached to grass itself. So they take living stems, they split the leaves, and then they interweave them into a tight ball that won't fall apart when you pick them up. And each time that the female breeds, she creates a new nest, which may potentially get destroyed by the number of young that she has, but quite often they survive. And these can normally be found after the breeding season, so basically from October all the way through to just after Christmas. Although you can still find them January, February, March, by that time you had an awful lot of winter storms come through, a lot of the vegetation has fallen over and quite a few nests get destroyed. But you can still go out and do surveys and find nests. Owl pellets is always a possibility, but because the animal is so small, quite often we find that their skulls actually get crushed and you don't get a full skull in there. But if you do manage to separate out and get down to a very small skull, then the identifying feature is that on the upper jaw, if you pull out the first cheek tooth, it has 5 root canals. Now that can be confusing with common rats because they also have the same, but the size difference. Even a young rat is going to be much larger than a harvest mouse skull within this one. So it's a fairly good indication that's there. Of all the people that look at owl pellets, very few people find harvest mice remains within them. It's really quite a challenge. Food-wise, it doesn't give an awful lot of calorific value to owls, so therefore it's not the best food for them, and they much prefer to go for the larger species such as field voles. You might be unlucky or lucky, I'm not sure which it is. If you've got cats, they might bring you presents, and that quite often gives you an indication of what's there. So they might actually bring you in a dead harvest mouse, and sometimes people do just find them out in the countryside, and that's again gives us an insight to where these animals could be or are. And occasionally you can actually trap them with Longworth traps, in which case it's really quite fun. You empty your trap into your bag and you think there's nothing there because they weigh so little, you just don't register as an animal. And quite often I've just about come to throw the bedding out and suddenly a little mouse appears and you get quite excited, because in the 40 odd years that I've been trapping, I've only caught about 5 of these animals in traps. Some people do slightly better, but they're not the easiest thing in the world to catch. So where do you actually start looking for harvest mice? You've got to remember that they basically want to travel through vegetation at the sort of stem and leaf level. So if you're looking at short grassland, as you can see in this picture, then you're not going to be in the right place looking for harvest mice. But if you go down towards the water's edge where you've got a little bit of reed canary grass, then you've got more of a chance. So it's trying to work out what vegetation is going to be best, and it tends to be those taller species of reeds, of phalaris reed canary grasses, of sedges, and even of rushes and soft rushes that the animal is going to find its best habitat, plus also the tussock grasses such as cotsfoot. So even in this landscape here, I have to admit the people that are in this picture are actually looking for field voles, but you can see these clumps of cotsfoot in the foreground and some wood rushes towards the back, and even some reed mace. They're the better places to look for the harvest mouse, but it's where that leaf layer is. So for the cotsfoot, it's on the actual tussocks. And if you go back towards the back left-hand picture, then it's actually going to be in the leaf layer of those particular rushes that you're going to be able to have a possibility of finding the nests. So even on hedgerows, provided they haven't been cut, as this one has, as the long grasses grow up through the fences and the brambles, then that's another good place where you're going to find harvest mice. The stems are close enough together. The leaf is going to be at about sort of 2/3 of the way up that plant, and there's good connectivity for the animal to run backwards and forwards. Here's a hedgerow. Again, there's a little bit of a ditch. You can see Phragmites in the ditch, and it's going to be on that area you're going to find the harvest mice. The short grass onto the right of the picture isn't suitable, so you very much concentrate on looking for the right vegetation to do your searches in, to give you a much better chance of finding the mice. So this is much more ideal, but you can see this was about January when we were looking here. An awful lot of that vegetation has fallen over. We find it slightly easier if you do this as a group. You get a little bit of a competition going. My colleagues in Staffordshire still insist that I actually keep harvest mice nests in my pocket, because they manage to walk past and not find one, and I follow them and say, have you missed this one? And you've missed that one. And they get quite annoyed with me. So just in this little patch in that year, we found 5 different nests. Now, what you can't do is you can't say you've got 5 nests, that's 5 mice, because that could be one female that's produced 5 nests for 5 different breeding occasions. We still don't really know how big a space they actually need, and sometimes you can find 2 nests within very close proximity to each other, at only a couple of centimeters away within the vegetation. Again, here you can see this nice dense vegetation, plenty of opportunity to actually move from stem to stem, and again, a good place to actually look for harvest mice. But it's not just those areas, there's other areas. So if any vegetation has got this closeness of stems and the leaf matter, then it can be found. So on the right hand side here, we've got an area that was cut from elephant grass, and we actually found harvest mouse nests in elephant grass. And on the right, you've got a set aside area that, again, you've got a mixture of millets and small small plants that are sort of clumping together into a quite close sward. And again, we actually managed to find them in that area as well. Now, this is quite often the picture that you get. And unfortunately, on the whole, we don't tend to find them in cereal crops anymore. And that's basically because of, as this picture shows, look how far apart the stems are. It becomes quite difficult for the poor old harvest mice to then move between, because there's such a large gap. They'd much prefer to have another stem in the middle so they can actually move through that area much better. And it's where the leaf is. So again, on these stems, it would be just below the seed heads in the main body that you'd actually find nests if it was going to be there. When they weren't drilled in set lines and they were actually hand sown, you would get clumps very close together, and that's where you would actually get harvest mice nests. And that's basically where they got their name from, because as you cut the fields, all these mice would therefore run away. And they would then use the stalks and the stooks, rather, as you dry out the grass, to go use it for nests as well, before they then got taken away. These sorts of photographs are a little bit of a cheat. You very rarely will see an animal that exposed, because all the predators, all the avian predators, are going to find that very, very easily, and therefore it doesn't really happen in reality. So what you're looking for in the vegetation is basically this. It's got to be able to have that easy step across from one stem to another, and that makes all the difference that goes with it. On their actual feet, they have 5 toes, but they have the ability with their 5th toe, which is slightly further round on their foot, and so it almost becomes like an opposable digit, so they can actually grip the stems quite easily and actually aid with their climbing within that. So when you look at this Phragmites bed, the fact that you can see through the stems makes it not that practical for harvest mice to be in. And you can spend an awful lot of time looking for harvest mice nests in an area that is suboptimum for their habitat, because they can't easily move from stem to stem within that habitat. So here is a nest. They are normally connected, or they are connected to the vegetation. So you can't just put your hand in and pull it free. It's actually as connected to living stems because it's made from the leaves of living plants. And how they actually do is they lean forward, they grip the leaf, and then they shred them through their teeth. So it goes into multiple sections. And then those sections can then be used to create this weave that actually holds the ball together. Now this is slightly different. This still is a woven nest that's into a ball. Some of the vegetation is still split and shredded, but this is actually a dormouse nest found in a hedgerow rather than a harvest mouse nest found in grass. And sometimes the size of the nest can be very similar, and we have discussions on who's actually made this nest, and it's trying to work out the ins and outs. On the whole, harvest mice just use the grass materials, where dormice will incorporate an awful lot of other things into their nest that go with it. Plus also, that nest you could actually pull out of the tree. It's not connected, it's merely just resting within that structure. When we're actually trying to find the nest within the vegetation, quite often, even though you might not get a full ball there, if you've got an area where all these grasses have been neatly shredded, as you can see just off to the left-hand side of the picture, that shows a harvest mouse might have started to think about the nest, but maybe hasn't completed it. And every time we find a nest, we normally find vegetation close to that's been shredded but hasn't been incorporated into the nest. And you can see here they're actually shredding green material to add to it. So it does blend in very nicely, which is why as the grass, as they first build them being green, you can't see them very easily. And as they start to die off, the grasses, the nests die off at the same time, and it's still that well camouflaged bundle of leaves that you're trying to find. So here there's no nest at all, but you can see the shredded grasses. So you can still count that as evidence, because nothing else is going to do that unless you're near a woodland, in which case it might be dormouse. But generally on the grasses, you can just say that's a sign of harvest mice. So about 10 days before giving birth, the female wants to make a nest to actually give birth in. So you can see here that she grips the stem with both back feet and tail, and then she pulls a grass stem from an adjacent stem across to her. She basically bites the middle of those strains and pulls back so it splits along the longitudinal veins. And then she uses that to start to actually create a base that looks very similar to a bird's nest before then moving on to actually build up a dome on top of it. And even when it's complete, there's normally no direct entrance. They basically push their way in and push their way out again as they go in and out of the nest. So it's quite good on the thermodynamics. And it tends to be, depending on the vegetation, as I said, very much within that leaf area. And you can see dimensions wise, 6 to 10 centimeters is about right. Smaller ones, so for winter nests for an individual or even individuals non-breeding, then it's about the size of a golf ball, and they're much harder to find. If we look at the breeding habits, then basically they can breed after about 40 days, and they breed from May through to September, October, depending on the weather. Sometimes they can even go into November if it's a nice warm winter. So although we're looking for nests October onwards or thereabouts, there might be some still active, but generally we don't find any mice in occupation. The gestation period is, as you can see there, about 17 to 19 days. And the weight of the female goes up from about this 8 grams to about 15 or 16 before giving birth. She starts building her nest a couple of days before she's going to give birth, but it depends on the weather how long that actually takes. The birth itself is a fairly rapid process with a little bit of time between each one. They are born naked and blind, and it takes a bit of time to fur up first. They basically have a high milk content, and they gain about 15% of their weight or the adult weight daily to bring them up to that. Okay. They basically on milk for about 14 days, and they are there independent at 15 or 16 days, and they then disperse soon after that. And the female then comes back, is then available for mating once again. A male will find her, and the whole process starts again, so that within this you can actually have up to between 3 and 7 litters a year. And lots of people who keep these as pets find if they don't separate the males from the females fairly soon afterwards, then quite often they suddenly have second litters all over the place, because they have this 40 days, they're about ready to start again. So the whole process is quite fairly quick, and they need to have a fairly good population during the summer to allow them to lose some over winter because of the heat problem that they have. As far as life expectancy goes, you can see this is here is a your litter of 7 and a female in a, well, it's no longer in a nest because they've basically broken out of it. But life expectancy is, they reckon, between about sort of 14 and 18 months, but in reality it's probably 6 months. In captivity, they've actually kept to life for about 5 years. So you can see just how difficult life in the wild can be in comparison. Over the years, we've tried a variety of different methods to try and find them. And since an awful lot of mammals and birds seem to like nest boxes, somebody came up with the idea of, well, why don't we provide them with a nest box? And the idea here was that we'd actually use tennis balls from Wimbledon as a nice publicity stunt. We could stick them out into long grasses to try and find out harvest mice to get to, would use them. So we'd actually create these holes in tennis balls, we'd put them out, and we found all sorts of interesting things, like it wasn't just harvest mice that would use them, but young wood mice and bank voles would also climb the vegetation and use them as well. So it wasn't exclusive, and we couldn't really use it to say, yes, we've just found harvest mice. We also found that if you put a little bit of grain inside them and you put them too close to the fence, then cows ate the tennis balls. So it wasn't always that great success, but a lot of people still remember the idea of, oh, we can put out a tennis ball and you should get a harvest mouse. Generally, we tend to find them in traps. So these are both the Longworth and the tube trap. You can set things so that they are will trip out on the light weight for the harvest mouse. But what we find is, if you're not careful, you get wood mice and field voles and bank voles in these before you get the harvest mouse. So we tend to put in little excluders, which is a little weld mesh screen, which is about 9 millimeters on the mesh, and that allows harvest mice to go through that mesh to set the trap off, to go from there. And on a study in Warwickshire, they found harvest mouse on the ground through that trapping method. On every site they found nests, but they didn't find, if they just trapped on their own, they didn't always find harvest mice. We've also in the past tried to put the traps on little platforms higher up in the grass, thinking to ourselves that the only animal that's going to be in that grass is going to be the harvest mouse. But again, just like the tennis balls, we caught everything but. So at that height of vegetation, that's about 60 centimeters above the ground, we caught wood mice, field voles, bank voles, water shrew, common shrew, but we didn't catch any harvest mice. But the trap that was directly below it, we caught harvest mice. So that still doesn't really sort of tie in with what we thought, that the harvest mice are just using those stems to try and get an exclusive ecological niche, because other animals seem to be there, but they are less agile on that with the heavier weights. They don't have that same ability to move through them, and therefore the harvest mouse still has that advantage. We've even tried, this is the 9 mil weld mesh, to actually put grain inside of this beaker, and then you put this out into the vegetation, and the animals go through to get the grain and leave their droppings behind. Or sometimes you can put cameras on, and therefore you can pick up the mice using that. But we still found, for all that effort, it's still, for the amount of positive returns you get, you're spending an awful lot of energy to try and find a record, and nest searches are actually still that better option. A young lady is doing some research at I think it's Worcestershire University, where they're trying to get detecting dogs to actually smell out harvest mouse droppings. So as it goes along these stakes, one or two of the bottles have got harvest mouse droppings from their captive harvest mouse population, and the idea is the dog's supposed to actually point those out. Detection dogs have been used very successfully for a range of different species, but I have to admit I'm not sure how easy it is to sort this one out, and I'm not sure how far she's actually got with her research. When it comes down to finding them, it's a case of you've got to look. So this field here is tuxedo grasses. Again, we were actually doing Longworth trapping on this night, and we decided, right, we'll have 10 minutes trying to find a harvest mouse nest, and hey presto, we found one in under 5 minutes. It's a case of looking, but the more people you have, the better off you are at having a chance to find them. It is possible to do it on your own, but again, it's just that statistics of more people looking was the greater chance. There've been a variety of different counties that have tried their best to find harvest mice in the past. So this is basically from the Staffordshire Atlas of 2007, where we've got quite a few records. But it was quite interesting when we started looking for harvest mice in about 2000. The last record for Staffordshire was about 60 years before, in about the 40s, and then nothing. And we thought, well, that can't be right. It looks like it should be all right. So we went out and learned how to do surveys for nests. We came back as a group. We went to a national nature reserve, and we found nests on that national nature reserve for the first time in the first half hour of looking. And since then, as a group, every time we go out, we have harvest mice in our mind at the back, and we have this competition to see who can find the first one during the winter months. And we've got fairly good distribution throughout Staffordshire, but we need to do more to actually increase our knowledge of where they really are. Essex have done an awful lot better, and Essex went out specifically to find harvest mouse basically in every 2 tetrad, which is a 2 kilometre square, and they succeeded very easily. And it's just a case of people looking in the right way and having that determination to keep on looking to go with it. An awful lot of these sites were on road edges, hedgerow edges, where you have the bramble and the rank grasses coming through, and they've managed to basically have a very, very good distribution for the whole of Essex without any real problem. And other counties where they haven't didn't think they had harvest mice, once we've got them to start looking for harvest mice, then they're finding harvest mice on a much more regular basis. And this is Cornwall with their 2013 atlas, that again, they started to pick up more and more sites once they got the idea of how to look for them again, and that's made a difference. And because of that, we then decided that as the Mammal Society, we ought to try and instigate a national survey to utilise the local groups that have been doing some sterling work over the years and try to extend the range of who's looking and where they're looking, so we can get a better picture of the harvest mouse distribution and also which grasses they prefer. So we can actually give some positives on how to manage the habitats better for harvest mice as we go through. If you want any information on this, please go to the Mammal Society's website, and if you look at surveys, you'll find information on how to actually carry out a survey for us. But if you need any help, then please feel free to contact us. Within the survey, we're basically asking you to look at a 200-metre square area, and that could be an awful lot of different things. That could be a linear fence line survey. It could be a block of reed canary grass in a wet meadow. It can be a larger clump there, or it can be built up over a period. Here we looked at how long it takes to find that first nest. And you can see the longer that you're looking for, the less likely you are to find nests. So they should be relatively easy to find from that initial start off. Trying to have a set area that you're looking for gives us much better statistical results when we're coming to look. But the survey effort is important. We need to know how many people are looking, how long they've taken to find that first nest to actually increase this the data for this kind of graph. So now it's a question of spot the harvest mice. This was down in Radipole Lake, and they wanted to find out how to do it. And we walked across the lake. First place we looked, hey presto, in the Phragmites, there's the nest. But nobody's ever looked. And if you don't look, you don't find. Here we've got some sedges. And again, there's the nest. You can see that there, the actual grasses there are much smaller than the sedges, and that's because other grasses grow up between, and that's the ones they choose to use to actually make the nest within it. You tend to find that sedge warblers, reed warblers, and everything else, they don't actually connect their nests to the stems. So as the wind blows, they tend to fall out very soon. So we don't get too much confusion with birds' nests when you're actually looking within all of these. Okay, so again, vegetation, they spotted a nest. It's a sort of slightly off center down towards the bottom. And again, what we try to work out is how tall the vegetation is and whereabouts in that vegetation the nest is. And it tends to be, as I said before, in that leaf layer. So once you go above the leaf layer and you get into the stalks and seeds, then that's no good. They're not getting the cover that they need. They're not getting the materials they need to actually make their nests. If you're looking at the cotsfoot, then it's actually inside the tussock that's important, or sometimes underneath the tussock. And sometimes you really have to push down quite deep to actually find out where that nest is. And there was a little bit more detail on that one to see how it just sits in. But it's something that once again can be quite easily overlooked if you don't know what you're looking for. So you can see this is one of my volunteers, Paul. He appears an awful lot of the photographs because he's very good at finding harvest mice. And on this occasion, he's found an individual nest about the size of a golf ball. And here you can see it's actually in soft rush. There's a little bit of wood rush and stuff next to it, but it's actually in the soft rush, which isn't always where we expect to find them. And it's quite close to the ground. So that's a 50p piece next to it to give you an indication of what that actually looked like. Sometimes it's just a case of you walk along and they suddenly become obvious to you. So this picture, not the best picture in the world, I have to admit, but if you look down, you can see a solid structure about a third of the way up the picture in the middle, and that's a harvest mouse nest in a row of young trees that have just got tall grasses growing up through it. So this is fescues on this occasion, and the nest was just there. And this was after a long day of trying to find them elsewhere, and the last nest of the day was, we all went, it's just there. And just occasionally that happens. And this is another one again on a hedgerow. This one's the top third of the picture, again fairly central. And just as you walked along the path, everyone walked past it, didn't really see it. But once you get your eye in, these things stand out and become a little bit more obvious. And even on moorland, I know Staffordshire were very lucky to have lowland moor. We also got upland moorland as well. And we found that in the more grasses, we can still go find harvest mice. And that's, I would never have thought of looking in there as a habitat for them. And it was only because my volunteers, whenever we go out and have this competition, we just look and we find them in the most peculiar places. So I know this is going back to that hedgerow that you saw before, but here you can see there's a nest just in that. It's not very thin, but don't forget this has been cut. So it's it exposes where that nest is. Normally that'd be covered by other things. And again, this vegetation, again, it's the rushes on a wetland area. And again, even though the vegetation has fallen over, once you look through those clumps, it becomes fairly obvious where those nests are going to be. During the summer, they'll be quite tall, but we've already had the winter winds come through on this one. I've never managed to find a summer nest. I've looked, and that's on the one occasion I saw a mouse run in front of me. But even though I've gone through reed beds and other areas, I've never managed to find a summer nest, although I know some of my colleagues have. Oh, let's go back to that one. That one is a field vole nest rather than a harvest mouse nest. Field voles will use some of this vegetation that's fallen over and actually create nests made out of short cut pieces of grass which they pile together, and then they get in amongst it and turn round and make it into some sort of ball. And quite often people find these and get quite excited, but once you pick this up and you bounce it in your hand, it falls apart, and that shows that it's a field vole rather than a nest that basically keeps its shape for the harvest mouse. And this is the one that was appeared in the reed canary grass. Not reed canary grass, elephant grass. Getting ahead of myself. But we still have difficulties. So this nest was sent to me. It was in amongst some nettles and raspberry canes. These are the only photographs I've got. It's quite a big nest. It is sitting in a grass clump, but it's not typically what you'd expect to find from harvest mice. But there's no records of dormice on this site. And even up to now, I can't make my mind up which way it should go, whether or not this is a dormouse or whether this is a harvest mouse. And since then, unfortunately, they came in and they trimmed the whole lot down. They haven't managed to find any other nests on that site since. So we still get some quandaries of not quite knowing what it is. I'm probably going to push down towards harvest mice. But as I say, no other nests were found in that area. So it really is still a little bit of a conundrum. Down in Devon, they had a harvest mouse project officer where they decided they wanted to try and work out something more about how harvest mice are actually utilizing the habitat. So what they were trying to do on this occasion is look at the number of nests that they were finding. So if you look at the nests per 100-meter transect, they found more in set-aside, none in the grazed area, and some in the hay and winter grazing. Most of the time it was looking at cotsfoot, and they found that the older the cotsfoot, then the better off, or the more cotsfoot you had, the better off you had for finding harvest mice. And the nest abundance was basically the longer the grass had been left uncut, the more chance you had of finding nests. It's all fairly almost obvious stuff, but it needs to be looked at because we need to know just how long it takes harvest mice to get back into a suitable habitat if someone has come in and cut that area. So the number of nests basically increased with the number of cotsfoot clumps. It was rarely found in grazed fields, and it's most common as the time that it was uncut increased. We found that they did find that the number of, although the number of clumps was important, the actual size of the clumps of cotsfoot wasn't that important. So there was some sort of connectivity between the different clumps that allowed the animal to move around that particular area. And most of our sightings on that one were just in the cotsfoot. Now, all these nice pictures that you see of an animal standing on bits of corn or standing on the top of a bit of vegetation is totally cheats. So here you have 3 people try not to get each other in shot where you've got a harvest mouse sitting on that bit of vegetation in a washing up bowl full of water, in which there is a flower pot with some oasis in it, and the stem is then stuck into it. Most of these shots that you see of harvest mouse are made up in this way. And it's important because one of the things that's quite often said is if a harvest mouse is disturbed when it's in the top vegetation, then it jumps off and falls down to the ground. When none of these animals that have ever been photographed jump off the vegetation. Now, it could be that they're just used to being handled, but I doubt it very much. We learn an awful lot by looking at the captive animals that we have, because they're much harder to actually to study in the wild. So I'm going to stop at this point and allow you to ask some questions, but it really is a case of come and find me if you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. Differently to our last webinar, we are actually going to stop for a 5-minute recess in case anyone needs to grab a drink or go to the toilet quickly before we do some questions. So we will meet back here at, well, this is going to be a really awkward time, about 8:28 for some questions. So if anyone can think of any really interesting questions to pose to Derek in the meantime, then pop them in the chat and we can pose them to a harvest mouse expert. But we will see you back here in 5 minutes time. Okay. Thank you very much, Derek.
Okay.
We have lots of questions coming in for you, Derek, so I hope you're ready.
Yes, I'm just having a quick flick through to see what's there. So
yeah, so you can prepare your answers.
I can rack my brains to remember who the various people are. I think somewhere we know who the person who's doing the detection dogs. I think they've done a blog for us.
Okay, I will try and find that quickly then.
I think they have.
If not, Beth will know and I can contact that person separately.
Yeah.
Ah. All right, we've just got a couple more minutes and then we'll get back to it.
Right.
Right,
look up
we
conservation
will
status.
start in a second's time.
Uh,
I think my watch is a bit fast, but it's okay. Right. You found the answer to your question, Derek, or not?
I'm just looking up the conservation status
Perfect.
and what we said about them from the review.
You all ready, Derek?
I'm ready.
Perfect. So first of all, I would like to say thank you so much for such an entertaining and interesting talk. I know that I certainly learnt a lot, and I hope that everyone else did too. So on to our questions. That's the real reason that people are here, I'm sure. So our first question is, do you recommend Longworth traps over footprint tunnels? I think
I would. It's difficult if you're putting footprint tunnels in the vegetation. We tend to find there's an awful lot of other mammals that appear in them first. It can be very difficult to then ensure that you're actually going to find a harvest mouse print that hasn't been overrun by something else. And it's I don't know how easy it is. I haven't used that method myself, but if I use excluders within traps, then you can basically guarantee if there's harvest mice in the area, then you should be able to pick them out because you're going to exclude the larger mammals from coming in.
Perfect. Well, I hope that answered your question, Julia. Our second question is from Emily Wood, and it is about the name/university of the person trialing the detection dogs. But as Derek has said, have you found it, Derek, or not yet?
I haven't managed to find that one. I'm fairly certain that they did do a piece in either Mammal News or they've written a blog for us in the past.
Perfect.
So I'm sure that we can find that in our archives and get back to you on that one.
Of course. So Emily, if you would like to drop us an email separately, then we can send you the link once we find it, hopefully tomorrow. Our next question is from Erica, and they say, I'd love to do surveys, but I'm in Scotland. Is it worth doing them up here, even just to show that they aren't present this far up?
Well, I have to say that I've just come back from doing a weeks-long survey of Scotland. Nature Scott very kindly gave us some funding, and I went around all the historic sites. And I have to say that I didn't find any harvest mice on that occasion, but I am convinced that they are in Scotland. Earlier, before I did this survey, I was working up there and I found a new site at Strathclyde Country Park for harvest mice that have never been recorded in that area before. So yes, carry out surveys, send us the results, tell us where you've looked, just follow our protocol. We'll be delighted to hear from you. And we are hoping that in the near future, we will actually get some local Scottish groups up and running where you can talk to other people who are like-minded and carry out lots more survey work for us.
Perfect. Our next statement is from Julia. She says, we leave piles of blackthorn cuttings in the meadows for the grasses to grow up through during spring and summer. The nests seem to be more common in the blackthorn/grassy piles, e.g. 3-in-1 piles when the grasses die back in the winter. Have you seen this before?
I haven't seen that, but when we're looking, if we will go to places like fences and brambles and low-lying saplings with branches that are there, because they hold up the stems a lot longer, they don't fall over, and a lot of harvest mice seem to prefer to have that security of the against the wind on those long grasses. So it's a good idea to do that. I'll have to try it elsewhere.
Oh, brilliant. Our next question is from Jen, and they ask, have thermal cameras been used to find occupied nests at potential sites in summer?
Not as far as I'm aware. Thermal imaging is an area that is still being looked at for a variety of different things. It's still a question of trying to get the right thermal camera that will give you the ability to focus down within that. I think it's an area that should be looked at to make life easier for an awful lot of smaller mammals to actually find them. So if you have a thermal camera, please go out and try it, and then you can write up a nice little paper for our mammal communications page. It'd be very interesting to find your results.
Yes, I'd love to read that paper, so do follow Derek's advice. Our next question from Camilla: could the larger nest you were talking about have been from a water vole?
Generally not. Not within that vegetation. It's unlikely to be a water vole. A lot of water voles actually put those in burrows rather than being on the surface.
Oh, interesting. Our next one is from Hayley, who says, how easily are harvest mice disturbed? For instance, when carrying out a water vole survey, pushing yourself through the reeds, does this cause the reeds to often fall over?
It can do, but again, it doesn't seem to disturb them. When I've tried that myself, looking for harvest mice in the summer to try and find a nest, one, I didn't find any nests, and two, I did disturb a harvest mice, but it ran away in front of me. In the winter, we believe that the harvest mice move down the stems and spend more time on the ground than actually in the stalks, and those old nests become redundant. So there's very little chance of disturbance at that point.
Thanks, Derek. William asks, will they nest over water?
Yes, no problem whatsoever. A lot of our sites that we look at are very damp, or in reed beds, we're actually standing in water trying to do the surveys. And we know in areas where they'll actually be nesting in floodplains, and we know that the animals will actually disperse with a flood as it goes down. So we've actually seen them. We haven't seen them floating down the river as such, but we found them further down after a flood that's gone through. Yeah, over water isn't a problem, but it isn't a problem either for bank voles and wood mice. And quite often in reed beds, you'll find those quite distant over water as well.
Oh, how interesting. Jen and Liz have asked, are there any surveying groups in Somerset and Northamptonshire?
I think the easiest answer to that is we'll get Charlie, who's on the line with us tonight, to note down your details, and we'll send you, get you in contact with the right people, and also to get you signed up to our newsletter for the Harvest Mice survey.
Yes, we'd love everyone on this call to sign up for the Harvest Mouse survey if possible. Next from Andrew, does surveying ever take place during the breeding season?
Generally, no. We try not to do it in the breeding season because of disturbance. If a harvest mouse got disturbed when it had young, it would probably eat them. So therefore, we try to survey after the breeding season that goes with it. So although I was in Scotland in late or early October, we consider the weather up there to be a shorter breeding season than you'd find in southern England. And in southern England, a lot of groups don't actually start looking until about now to try and make sure that last breeding has gone through. I've noticed on the chat that someone has very kindly said that the person doing the work with her retriever is Emily Howard Williams at Malton College, Northampton.
Perfect. Maria asks what the conservation status is of the harvest mouse.
The harvest mouse has been a BAP species for some time, and under the latest mammal review that was done, I shall quickly get out the very good publication by the Mammal Society 2 years ago.
Pay Derek to say this, by the way, everyone.
I haven't got my name on that one, so it can't be right. So at the moment, we're looking on across the country. It's basically least concern, but it's vulnerable in Wales and in Scotland because of its unknown status, because of the very few records. It's looking at being extinct if it was there or if it wasn't there. So it's very much of the high conservation status in Scotland, and Scotland Nature Scott are very keen to get any records to try and establish what's happening to the population there.
Perfect. Our next question from Jennifer. You may have already addressed this, but is there any way to set camera traps for harvest mice?
There have been. Where we looked at that plastic container in the metal cage, they've been set up in vegetation, high vegetation, and then a camera trap's been put near. There's a lady called Wildlife Kate, who some of you might be aware of. She's managed to film some harvest mice that visited a bird table, basically, but again, that was actually set into reed bed vegetation, and she had about 3 or 4 harvest mice come jump on the bird table. That was in about January 3 or 4 years ago.
Wow, that's brilliant. Our next question from Emily. You briefly mentioned that harvest mice may be kept as pets by some people. Is there a trusted / ethical source you could recommend to learn more about this? I'm not looking for wild pets, but I keep rats, so the idea fascinates me.
It's probably best to get them from other people. The Wildwood and the British Wildlife Centre, I know they have populations and keep them quite often. Some of the colleges for their animal care department have them, and also people like Derek Gow has a population as well. Once you get 2 animals, you'll soon have lots. The biggest issue that I do have with people who keep them as pets is that quite often they get so many very quickly, they don't know what to do with them, and they think, I know, I'll let them go. And I'll let them go in the wild because they're a British species, and I don't know of any harvest mice in the area. And the problem here is that unless you carry a good survey, you don't know what your population status is. We've had this in 1 or 2 counties that have in the early days that said, well, we haven't got any records for the last 50 years. They can't be there. And we said, well, let's come down and do a survey for you. We've discovered the harvest mice. And they go, oh, and then they've looked and looked again, and suddenly they're all over the county, and you don't need to do a re-release at all. If a release happens, it ought to follow the recommendations of wildlife releases from the International Conservation Network. And the other thing to say with this is you don't know what diseases that you'll then be putting out from your population.
Which is very important. Just a few more questions for you. Have there ever been any records in Ireland from Annie?
No, not yet.
That was quite a quick question then. Perfect.
I say not yet because in Ireland there are many small mammals that are suddenly appearing, and we're not sure how they're getting across to Ireland.
Oh, how interesting. Our next question is from Emily. I assume they are difficult to sex accurately if people can keep them as pets and then have lots and lots of them.
You can sex them just the same way as you can sex other mouses or mices. So there's not really a problem on that. It's the fact that they do mature quite quickly. And therefore, if you haven't quite often, if you have got the female in there, she's had her young, she's lactating, she comes off lactating, she's susceptible again. If you've still got the male around, then by the time you've turned around, he's already visited, and therefore you've got another litter on the way in another 17, 18 days.
Wow, it happens in the blink of an eye then. Our next question is, has there been any harvest mouse reintroductions? And that one's from Kate.
People have reintroduced them to fairly small areas that are there, but again, so there's been some in the northeast. There's been some. They've tried some around the Sheffield area, although there's plenty around Sheffield, and some individuals who have got their own land think it'd be a good idea to release on their land, but again, they haven't looked to see if they've got any. They just assume that they're not there. But harvest mice are very good into actually distributing themselves to new areas.
Interesting. And just a couple more questions for you, Derek. Rebecca asks, what is the highest altitude that you have found harvest mice at?
Pass.
We'll get back to you on that question then, Rebecca. Thank you for it. Our next question comes from Jen, and it says, do you need a license to trap them?
You need a license if you're going to have the possibility of catching shrews, although you can have Longworth traps with shrew holes in. If you've got a shrew hole in, the harvest mouse will get out. So you need a license for using traps in England, but it's a general license, and in Wales and Scotland you need to have references in order to get that license.
Interesting. Right, our last question is from Lauren, and it is, are individuals at all territorial?
We don't think so. It's difficult. In captivity, where they can be kept in quite high numbers, we know there's aggression between them, and quite often they do things like tail biting. So there's quite a few in captivity might have shortened tails. In the wild, they probably do have a territory that, or an area that they will defend, but it's not going to be or an area that they use. I'm not sure how much they defend it. There's probably interaction between males. Again, it's this difficulty of trying to work out what happens in the wild when you're using captive animals for most of your knowledge. It's very difficult to find a harvest mouse in the wild, and then to try to study it to work out what it's doing is almost as difficult. I know that the BBC have been trying for some time to actually get a harvest mouse on film making a nest. They're using captive animals rather than wild animals. They've because of the difficulty trying to find one. The last time they tried, they put a couple of mice into a large tank, set the camera up, went out, came back after the next day, and the nest had already been built. So they missed it.
Oh no, that's ridiculous. So that's it, folks. And I would just like to say thank you again, Derek, for such a fascinating talk, and for everyone for some great questions in there. I hope that everyone has enjoyed our second webinar. And as Derek mentioned earlier, if you would like to get involved with any harvest mouse searches in your area, then you can either visit our website to get involved with the Harvest Mouse Survey, or email Charlie, who is over there on the video screen, at surveys@themammalsociety.org. But we'd love to hear from you, and thank you very much for coming along, and have a great evening.
And enjoy the rest of Mammal Week.
Yes, and most importantly, enjoy the rest of Mammal Week and get involved in all of our activities, because we love to spread the word of mammals. So have a lovely evening, and thank you again for your talk, Derek.
Pleasure.
Bye.